Yes and no. So what happened was there were a plethora of mythical creatures in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, as these were based on older myths, including Canaanite myths. And whenever later scribes were doing translations and turning Hebrew into Greek or Latin or English, if they weren't familiar with a particular word, they would just look at the context and plug in some appropriate word, or a word that they believed was appropriate. And this happened quite often when it came to mythological creatures. And so when they encountered this one particular word in the Bible, which I believe pops up maybe about 14 times in the King James Bible, when they encountered this one particular mythical creature, they didn't know what to do with it. They weren't familiar with the Israelite mythology, and so they changed it to a mythical creature that they were familiar with, and this was the unicorn. Now, originally it wasn't a unicorn. They weren't talking about a white horse with a horn on its head. They were talking about a creature, or a race of creatures, called the Reem, R-E-E-M. And there were two Reem, one male and one female. And at the beginning of time, they were separated. The male went to the east and the female went to the west, and they grew to enormous size. And by enormous, I mean the size of mountains. The Reem were giant oxen. And this may be connected with legends of the Behemoth, or maybe its own separate legend, but I suspect they're connected. Anyway, the Reem, whenever they would grow old, they would come together at the end of their life and they would mate. The male would then die, and the female would then give birth to two calves, one male and one female. She would then pass away. And the reason for this is because if they were to stay together for their entire life, they might mate too often and breed a whole giant race of giant oxen. And if that happened, they would become too numerous and too heavy, and this could crack the foundation of the world. They believed that the world was a disc held up by stone pillars. And the weight of these enormous creatures would eventually become so great that it could crack the foundations. And so because of this, the Reem were essentially cursed to live their entire lives apart until the end of their life cycle, when they would finally come together to mate just before they both died. These two animals, which were called the Reem, were relatively unknown outside of ancient Israel. As time moved on, people sort of forgot about them. They became these obscure passages in the Bible, and no one really knew what to do with them. So when the King James Bible was being translated, the scribes, they didn't quite know what to make of this obscure word. They had never heard of the Reem, but they knew it was supposed to be powerful, and in some cases it was Yahweh was being compared to the Reem, in strength. And so they thought, well, unicorns are pretty cool, so we'll make this a unicorn. And that's how the Reem, these two gigantic oxen that were the size of mountains, got mistranslated into unicorns. And so in the King James, you have unicorns. In other Bibles, they translate it into something else. I believe I saw rhinoceros in one translation, but the oldest copies say Reem.